Good afternoon, I'm Aline Finger, a conservation scientist at the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk about my work today. And I work on the conservation of rare and threatened Scottish plants, most of which will be affected by climate change. And I would like to present in particular one example of our Scottish Rare Plants programme. And that example is Cucurbita alpina, the alpine blue sow thistle. Cucurbita alpina is one of the largest and rarest Scottish boreal-montane plants in the UK. It's a very attractive plant with these deep blue-violet flowers. It's about 1.5 meters tall, perennial and insect pollinated. It is a submontane species found in Central European mountain ranges, and it is fairly common throughout Scandinavia. In continental Europe, you would find it in alpine woods, beside streams, in tall meadows, usually at high elevations between 1,000 and 1,800 meters. In Scandinavia, also down to sea level. But in the UK, we've only got 4 remaining populations, and they're all in Scotland, all within the Cairngorms National Park. And why are we working on this plant? It is at the brink of extinction in the UK. It is protected under a range of European and local legislations, and it is currently under immense threat by grazing and landslides more imminently, and climate change in the long term. And all of this taken together has led for the species to become a flagship for species recovery through changed land management. So these are the 4 populations in Scotland. We've got Corricanda, Corriffy, Loch Nagar and Cainlochan, and the populations are tiny. They grow in these ledges and in the gully, and are only a few square meters in size really, and they are inaccessible to sheep and deer. And that is very important because Cucurbita alpina is a very palatable plant. It is a close relative to our garden salad, so yeah, that's why. And most grazing animals really enjoy eating it. And in these populations, we've never seen any seedlings, so no natural regeneration. And there are possible reasons for that. So one might be overgrazing, so as soon as they leave their ledges, any seedlings that leave the ledges will just be eaten. Could be a lack of pollination and pollinators. Cucurbita alpina in Scotland grows at the westerly edge of its distribution range, so it could be a climatic issue and climate change, of course. So both could just lead to an unsuitable climate in Scotland. But it could also be genetic problems, such as inbreeding or low genetic diversity. To explore how to best protect the species, we are also working together with Nature Scot and monitor populations on a regular basis, and this is to see whether there are any changes in size, flowering, fruiting or seed production in these populations. And in this short video here you see population Loch Nagar hiding somewhere in one of the ledges. And in this short video here you see population Corricanda, typically these wet walls, and then the population just on one of the ledges, showing how vulnerable they are to any possible landslides. I was mentioning genetic problems, so I will explain what I mean by that. Looking at the comparison between Norwegian and Scottish plants, so on the left, you've got my colleague Duncan Haley in Norway standing next to a Norwegian Cucurbita, and you've got me on the right standing next to a Scottish Cucurbita. And below you've got pictures of the seeds that these plants have produced. And it looks like the larger Norwegian population created healthier looking seeds compared to the small Scottish populations. And such a reduced reproductive outcome is something that we often observe in small and isolated populations, and the reasons usually being genetic issues. And this is why it usually starts with habitat fragmentation, and fragmentation then reduces populations to reduces populations in size, but also in numbers of individuals, and fragmentation leads to isolation. So often these populations are found in small isolated patches. And small isolated patches then lead to elevated inbreeding, which is mating between close relatives. And inbreeding leads to the expression of deleterious or harmful alleles. Population isolation also leads to the loss of genetic diversity, and all this taken together leads to an elevated risk of extinction. And this is where our work comes in. This is where genetic rescue comes in. And genetic rescue is an increase in fitness of small populations resulting from the alleviation of inbreeding depression by immigrants. So in other words, if we have small and inbred populations and we bring new individuals or new genes into these populations, that should increase fitness. So in our research, we want to test whether genetic rescue is possible for Cucurbita alpina, but obviously also for many other rare species. So first of all, we wanted to know the current genetic state of wild populations. We wanted to know how much genetic diversity is left, whether there's inbreeding in populations, but also how many genetically distinct individuals are left in each population. And the genetic results showed that in Coricander we have 12 plants. I'm saying at least for all these populations because we may have missed some. So Coricander 12 plants, Cainlochen 11, Corifee 19, and Loch Nagar 14 plants. Now this is good and bad news. So the good news is that we've got more than just one plant per ledge or per population. And it could have easily been the case that we've just got the one plant because Cucurbita alpina reproduces clonally, so has got this rhizomal growth. But no, that's not the case, so that's great. The bad news is that these are really low numbers. And in the conservation genetics context, we usually say that a population to be genetically healthy should have at least 500 individuals. And Cucurbita alpina is nowhere near that number, and many other species and other populations of other species don't have these numbers. Even worse though, not just are the numbers really low, but the remaining individuals within populations are also highly related with each other. So within populations we have mainly full sips and cousins growing next to each other. And while this may be okay for this generation, if there's sexual reproduction in these populations, then the next generation will definitely struggle with inbreeding. But hopefully we can do something about this and we can help Cucurbita alpina. And the easiest way to do that and to do all sorts of experiments is to do that at the nursery, because we can do these experiments without having to disturb these vulnerable wild populations. And at the nursery here at RBGE we have a shade tunnel that is dedicated just for that purpose, to work on rare Scottish plants, and that is our Target 8 tunnel. Target 8 is one of 16 from the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which aims to ensure that 75% of threatened plants are protected in cultivation and then available for future translocations. So here we've done a genetic rescue experiment to see whether we can increase fitness by crossing between populations. And we grow representatives of all 4 Scottish Cercivita populations, plus plants from Norway. If you remember, the Norwegian plants were the healthy looking ones. And we selfed and crossed plants and did all sorts of combinations of crosses, represented here by these arrows, and that resulted in lots of crosses. And that was all done by hen pollination, and we've done that in 2 consecutive years, in 2017 and 2018. So I would like to share with you my preliminary results for this study, and I'm saying preliminary because I still need to add some of the 2018 data to this, but the results stay the same basically, and it's very promising results. We're really happy about this because it looks like genetic rescue is working. So when we cross between populations, we can increase plant size, so the leaf area size. When we cross between populations, we can increase the survival rate, at least compared to self plants. And when we cross between populations, the plants that we produce are also reaching maturity sooner. So taking all this together, hopefully that means there's a fitness benefit for these plants. But whether this benefit will last in the field in harsh Scottish conditions, that will be the real test. So the next step will be to plant these individuals out into the wild and see whether these fitness benefits remain. And the case of the Cercivita alpina it represents a much wider conservation issue, and many other species in the UK and worldwide are facing very similar issues. And I would like to mention 3 other examples of plant species that are struggling in a surprisingly similar way, though are very different species. The first example is Saxifraga hercules, the marsh saxifrage, which is another of these beautiful perennial plants with these yellow flowers and red-haired stem, and it's found on wet, space-rich flushes and mires. And this species too used to be much more widespread, formerly found near sea level, and it now only survives in its upland localities. I think there are about 7 left in Scotland. So Saxifraga hercules is also heavily affected by grazing and is not able to expand from its tiny little populations, and as a result it's forced to grow mainly vegetatively, so clonal growth rather than sexual reproduction, and many generations in isolation will equally affect the species genetically. My next example is Woodsia alvensis, Britain's rarest fern, which was over-collected during the Victorian fern craze. And we've now got less than 100 individuals that remain in the UK, distributed in 5 locations. It is classed as endangered in the IUCN Red List. And again, we've got another species that shows no regeneration in wild populations. And these wild populations are also in very steep areas with very unstable terrain, and they are all at risk of being lost altogether in just one landslide, for example. Several attempts have been made in the last 15 years to reintroduce this plant, but so far these reintroductions have not been particularly successful. And my final example is on montane willows. And I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record, but it's the same story again. So we've got a species that, or a set of species that have been more widespread and have been massively reduced in numbers and are now only found in small and isolated populations. Again, they've retreated to small ledges and steep areas where they escape grazing, and there's very little reproduction, very few seedlings found in these populations. And even worse, for willows we have male and female trees, and some of these populations just consist of male or female trees. So yeah, there are additional problems there when it comes to sexual reproduction. This is the Cairngorms Connect project that aims to restore, in particular, Salix laponum and Salix mercenitis populations in the Cairngorms National Park. And if you have more questions about this project, you can get in touch with Shaila Rao or ask me for more details later. So to sum all of this up, historic habitat fragmentation, land use change, pollution, all of this together has caused many species to remain with only few individuals. Contemporary grazing levels prevent natural expansion and often also limit translocation success. So as a result, most populations are left as small and isolated patches distributed in the landscape and with no gene flow to connect them. And following long-term isolation in such small populations, inbreeding has an additional impact on reproduction and fitness within these populations. Lowered fitness may impede species' abilities to cope with environmental change, such as climate change. And unfortunately, conservation translocations are an increasingly important tool to conserve species and to recreate gene flow between populations. But there are a lot of species, as we've seen, that are facing very similar issues. So there is a lot of work that needs done. Thank you very much for listening and for giving me the opportunity to speak here today.